When we look at a map of Saudi Arabia, NEOM takes up only a small fragment on the western edge of the country, just above the Red Sea. But in reality, this project has begun to occupy something much bigger: the imagination of the whole society and the attention of the entire world. It is no longer just an investment. It is a symbol. It is a question that grows louder and louder. How far can a vision reach before it collides with the limits of reality? This episode of our story will be about precisely those limits. The moments when a dream meets a constraint, when a plan written in a PowerPoint presentation crashes against desert heat, conservative tradition, or hard politics. Saudi Arabia has entered a stage where talking about a vision is no longer enough. It has to be carried out. And that means not just building roads, towers, and laboratories, but also changing mindsets, laws, and everyday life. And that is where the difficulties begin. Because NEOM is supposed to be a place where foreigners and locals live together. But how do you reconcile the openness of a global city with the religious rules of the kingdom? How do you create an enclave of modernity without triggering a sense of betrayal among those who still believe in the tradition of the desert? How do you bring millions of people to the desert when there is a shortage of water and the climate is getting more and more extreme? How do you make women who only recently gained the right to drive feel like equal participants in a technological society? How do you convince the young that the future truly belongs to them if they still know that every step they take depends on the state? These are the questions that will accompany us in this episode. Questions about the limits of a vision, economic limits, cultural limits, political limits, and psychological limits. Vision 2030 and NEOM are like a giant laboratory testing how far those limits can be pushed. Sometimes success comes easily. New cinemas open one after another, concerts draw thousands, and the world applauds the reforms. But sometimes the boundary turns out to be harder than it seemed. Clerics protest, families resist, investment costs grow faster than expected. The introduction to this episode is an invitation to travel along these boundaries, an attempt to understand what can really be changed in Arabia, and what remains like the rock of the desert, immovable. Because every vision, even the most spectacular one, must one day confront reality, and the borders of that reality often prove sharper than the desert sand carried by the wind. The boundary of nature. Saudi Arabia has always lived in the shadow of the desert: sand, wind, heat. These are not elements of the landscape, but daily adversaries that for centuries decided whether a person would survive or not. The Bedouins learned respect for nature. They knew the desert cannot be tamed. It can only be accepted and lived with. But NEOM is a project that says something completely different. The desert can be defeated. It can be turned into a city of the future. It can be made into a stage on which humanity will write a new story. And this is where the first boundary begins. Imagine a working day on a NEOM construction site. The temperature exceeds 45 degrees. Workers from Bangladesh, India, and Egypt, wearing helmets and safety vests, try to lay foundations. Sweat pours from their foreheads. The air is thick with dust. The air-conditioned offices of architects and the showrooms in Riyadh feel like another planet. In computer renderings, the line is green, cool, full of trees and streams. But the reality on the construction site is dust and scorching heat. This isn't just a question of comfort. It is a fundamental question. Can humans really subjugate nature? Saudi Arabia answers yes, investing in weather engineering, seawater desalination, and systems to cool entire streets. But every one of those solutions costs a fortune and devours energy. And a world that speaks ever more loudly about ecology and sustainability looks at all this with a mix of admiration and skepticism. Technology can do everything, repeat the experts hired by the state. Technology cannot replace common sense, reply the critics. And it is precisely on this boundary that the battle for NEOM is being fought today. Aisha, dreaming of life in a futuristic city, asks her brother, "Will there really be water in those streams like in the pictures? Or is it just a show for the world?" Abdul Rahman answers hesitantly, "If the state truly invests in it, there will be." But the desert does not forget. The desert always reminds you that it is the host. The boundary of nature is the most merciless because it knows no compromise. You can negotiate with politics, argue with tradition, have a dialogue with religion. But you cannot bargain with the climate. Sand and wind do not listen to decrees. That is why the first part of this episode asks the key question. Is NEOM a project that will truly defeat the desert, or just the illusion of an air-conditioned mirage? Because if the foundations cannot withstand nature, everything else, the visions, the plans, the contracts, will turn out to be nothing more than a dream drawn on glass screens. The boundary of tradition. In Saudi Arabia, every step toward the future is taken against a backdrop of deeply rooted past. This is not a simple generational gap. It is a clash between two value systems that sometimes seem to speak entirely different languages. Imagine a Friday afternoon in Riyadh. On one street, young people in jeans and sneakers are heading to the cinema to see a Marvel movie that not long ago would have been banned. On the neighboring street, older men in traditional white thobes walk into a mosque for prayer, looking disapprovingly at the crowds outside the multiplex. Both worlds exist side by side, but the tension is obvious. Modernization Saudi style, under Mohammed bin Salman, is fast, spectacular, and top-down. Concerts in Riyadh, esports tournaments, restaurants where women and men sit together. For the young, this is a breath of fresh air. For the older generation, a troubling sign that the country is losing its soul. This is no longer the Arabia I knew, says a 60-year-old former refinery worker. Too much noise, too many foreign customs. I'm afraid the children won't know the values I was raised with. Aisha hears this almost every day. Her mother, who spent her whole life in the shadow of the home, asks, "Do you really need that job? Isn't it enough that you have a family?" Aisha replies, "Mom, I want to have a choice. I want a life that doesn't end in the kitchen. For the mother, this is rebellion. For the daughter, a natural right. The boundary of tradition is hard to move because it touches identity itself. Religion, family, honor. These are the pillars that have defined society for decades. Modernization tries to introduce new values, individualism, creativity, competition. But these two worlds often collide. In small towns in the South, reforms still sound like rumors from television. There, a woman behind the wheel is rare, and a foreigner remains a stranger even after years of living there. In Riyadh and Jeddah, the opposite is true. Daily life changes rapidly, and young people increasingly boldly use their new opportunities. This split means Saudi Arabia is not one country, but two parallel realities. An anthropologist would say modernization in Arabia resembles a transplant experiment. New organs are being implanted into a body that needs them, but at the same time may reject them. The question is, will society accept this surgery or treat it as a threat to its own identity? Clerics hesitate between support and opposition. Some say Islam can coexist with modernity. Others warn the state is going too far. The authorities play a delicate game. They open doors but make sure no one forgets who controls the handle and the pace of change. The boundary of tradition is not as unforgiving as the desert, but it can be just as hard. Because even if NEOM's buildings are completed, the question remains, who will live in them? Will the traditional family accept new social norms? Can a conservative mentality be reconciled with a cosmopolitan lifestyle? These are questions without quick answers. But one thing is certain. If NEOM is to be a city of the future, it must find a way not only to defeat the desert, but also to make peace with its own tradition. The boundary of politics. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy, a sentence that sounds like a dry fact in political science textbooks, but in everyday life means much more. Here, the fate of the whole country, of billion-dollar investments, and of millions of citizens depends on a single person. Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince, Prime Minister, and architect of Vision 2030, is both the creator and guardian of this vision. He is the one who invites the world in, the one who decides the pace of reform, the one who gives NEOM its meaning. But absolute power has its limits, not in the formal sense. Here, the only limit is the prince's will, but in the global sense, because the world is watching, and international expectations are very different from Saudi Arabia's internal reality. Imagine a conference in Riyadh. In one hall, representatives of funds from New York, banks from London, and tech firms from Singapore. In another, Saudi officials who know every decision must pass through the palace. For investors, transparency, the right to criticism, and independent courts are natural. For the state, control, censorship, and loyalty are natural. It is a collision of two systems that still need each other if NEOM is to become something more than a glossy brochure. Mohammed bin Salman's politics are a game on several levels. Internally, it's about centralizing power and silencing dissent. Externally, it's about presenting Arabia as a modern partner open to the world and its capital. This balancing act is acrobatic. One misstep, and global expectations may turn against him. The case of Jamal Khashoggi is a stark example. The Saudi journalist murdered in the consulate in Istanbul. The world reacted with outrage, and the prince's image took a serious hit. Yet a few years later, investors returned, conferences again filled the halls, and Vision 2030 still attracts billions. This reveals the paradox of the political boundary. The West can criticize, but when huge money and Saudi Arabia's strategic role are involved, its criticism is often short-lived. Inside the country, however, the boundary of politics means something else. Citizens know that freedom of speech is limited, that decisions are made by those in power, and that every change is a gift from above. In a cafe, Abdul Rahman tells his friends, "We can dream, we can work, but remember, it's the prince who decides what is possible and what is not." Those words sound like a quiet mantra of a generation learning to live between new opportunities and an old authoritarian system. The boundary of politics also reveals itself in relations with other countries. Saudi Arabia wants to be a partner of the US, China, and Europe, but it does not want to give up its independence. It wants to attract investment but not be told what to do. It wants to be open on its own terms. This tension makes NEOM not only an urban project but also a geopolitical one, a place where different value systems are meant to meet, under the condition that the host keeps full control. Is such a balance possible? Can global expectations about transparency and human rights be reconciled with the absolute power of a prince? Will investors keep turning a blind eye to authoritarianism if the profits are high enough? This is the boundary of politics, unpredictable, fragile, dependent on the will of one man and the tolerance of the rest of the world. A boundary that may decide whether NEOM becomes a symbol of modernity or a monument to authoritarian ambition. The boundary of the economy. From the outset, Vision 2030 and NEOM have been advertised with numbers that impress. Trillions of dollars in investments, millions of jobs, thousands of projects. In presentations, everything looks like the mathematics of success. You just add up the figures and you understand the scale. But the everyday life of Saudis is not made of billions in spreadsheets, but of prices in shops, electricity bills, and the question of whether a salary will cover rent. This is where the boundary of the economy reveals itself. At official conferences, ministers talk about economic diversification, innovation, and advanced sectors. But in small towns, young people still dream of government jobs because that is the only stable option. In big cities, office towers and hotels rise, but many families still live in homes where luxury means an air conditioner and a television. Abdul Rahman, working on a startup, understands this well. Everyone talks about innovation, but how many of my friends really have the capital to start anything? Most end up going back to public sector jobs. It's safer, he says. Aisha adds, "You see NEOM ads everywhere, but at university many girls still think about early marriage, because for them that's a simpler path to security than a career." The boundary of the economy is split. On one side, billion-dollar projects that are supposed to transform the country. On the other, the daily reality of ordinary people, who must cope with the fact that the state has begun introducing taxes, that petrol is no longer nearly free, that life is getting more expensive. Anthropologists speak of a developmental dissonance, a situation where the elite live in a world of global conferences and futuristic visions, while society still functions in the reality of a traditional economy and dependence on the state. That dissonance is especially visible in Saudi Arabia. NEOM attracts cutting-edge technologies, but many cities lack basic public services. Then there is the question of employment. The government promises millions of jobs, but who will fill them? Many Saudis do not have the skills needed in the tech sector. That's why the state continues to hire foreigners, engineers, architects, managers, and that, in turn, breeds frustration among the young who ask, why do they get the best positions while we get training and internships? The boundary of the economy is ruthless. You can draw any vision you like, but bills come every month. Billions in presentations must turn into real benefits for citizens. If that doesn't happen, Vision 2030 will become a symbol of luxury for the few and of disappointment for the many. Can Saudi Arabia turn its billions into something that truly changes ordinary people's lives? Will NEOM be only a city for the rich and for foreigners, or will it genuinely offer opportunities to young Saudis? These questions mark the boundary of the economy, a boundary that cannot be cheated by propaganda or conferences. Because the economy, more than politics or religion, is measured in daily experience. And everyday life does not forgive the gap between promises and reality. The boundary of psychology. Every revolution begins in the mind. Vision 2030 is no exception. Because although government documents are full of figures, plans, and deadlines, in practice, Saudi Arabia's future depends on what its citizens think and feel. And this is where the hardest boundary lies, the boundary of psychology. Imagine a conversation between Abdul Rahman and his friends in a cafe. I want to start a company in NEOM, he says enthusiastically. I have an idea. I have energy. This could work. His friends nod, but one of them quietly asks, what if the state pulls back? What if the project loses funding? What if they suddenly change the rules? The silence that follows is heavier than any words, because they all know this is not an abstract question. It is a real fear. Psychologists would say young Saudis live in a state of cognitive ambivalence. On one hand, they have access to technology, the internet, global inspirations. They know it is possible to dream big. On the other hand, they grew up in a system where risk was always punished and obedience rewarded. This tension means that many of them dream out loud, but act cautiously. Aisha, studying computer science, speaks openly about it. I want to work in NEOM. I want to build apps. But I'm afraid that if something goes wrong, my family will say I should have stayed at home and not taken risks. I'm afraid the world won't accept me as I am, but I'm even more afraid that if I don't try, I will never be free. Her words show how the psychological boundary isn't only about fear of the state, but also of the family, of society, and of oneself. Fear and dreams walk side by side in Saudi Arabia like two parallel roads. On one, the big visions, plans, ad campaigns, and billboards in Riyadh promising a future without limits. On the other, quiet anxiety that any dream can collapse if those in power change their mind, or if society fails to accept new roles. The boundary of psychology is the hardest to move, because you cannot tear it down with decrees or billions of dollars. It is a boundary each person has to cross alone, in their own home, in their own family, in their own head. Abdul Rahman, Aisha, their friends, each of them makes a daily decision whether to trust the vision or stay in the safe shadow. And here lies the greatest risk of Vision 2030. You can build towers, buy technology, hire experts, but if people are still afraid to truly dream, the project will remain an empty shell. NEOM will become a museum of visions, not a living city. The boundary of psychology is a question of courage. Can Saudis believe the future is truly theirs? Will they have the strength to overcome the fear that has been part of their lives for decades? Because without that courage, even the most beautiful dreams will remain just a dream. The boundary of the world, Saudi Arabia, is no longer living in isolation. Every step of Vision 2030 is watched by the whole world, commented on in the media, analyzed on stock exchanges, and in think tanks. From the beginning, NEOM was meant to be a global project, not only for Saudis, but for the entire planet. And here another boundary appears: the boundary of the world. Imagine a conference in Davos. On stage, a presentation of the line, the vision of a future city with no cars, no emissions, fully sustainable. The audience applauds, journalists post photos, but afterwards in the corridors, you hear questions. Is this really possible? Can a country that until recently lived solely off oil build the most ecological city in the world? The West looks at Saudi Arabia with a mixture of fascination and distrust. Fascination, because the billions flowing from Riyadh open doors everywhere. Distrust, because people still remember the authoritarianism, the Khashoggi case, the restrictions on freedom. This duality means Saudi Arabia must perform on two stages at once, domestic and international. On the internal stage, Mohammed bin Salman can present himself as a reformer, visionary, modern leader. On the external stage, he must answer questions about human rights, democracy, and transparency. The boundary of the world is therefore not only political, but also reputational. Aisha talks to her brother about this. When I read foreign media, I see Arabia described as a country of contrasts. On one page, they write about NEOM, on the next, about repression. I wonder if we really are part of that modern story, or just its backdrop. Abdulrahman sighs, maybe just the backdrop, but if we manage to move one step forward, something will change anyway. The boundary of the world is unforgiving, because unlike the media in Riyadh, it cannot be fully controlled. The internet, global markets, world public opinion, all of this escapes the grip of a single man. And although Saudi Arabia has money, it doesn't always have a narrative that convinces everyone. That's why NEOM is not only an urban project, but also a PR project, a calling card meant to say, we are different, we are the future. But the question remains, will the world believe that story, or see only a facade? The boundary of the world is the last and perhaps the toughest. Because if Saudi Arabia cannot convince others that its vision is genuine, even the most beautiful cities may remain empty. And then, the future that was supposed to be shared will turn into nothing more than a local dream. The boundaries of vision. Saudi Arabia's boundaries are not lines on a map. They are living barriers, visible in daily life and politics, in the desert heat and in people's hearts. In this episode, we have traveled across all those boundaries, from nature, which reminds us that even the mightiest technologies must acknowledge its power, to tradition, which resists modernization, even as the young want to move forward. From politics, which gives and takes away with a single gesture of the prince, to the economy, struggling with the gap between billions in spreadsheets and the price of bread in a shop. From psychology, where dreams battle fear, to the global gaze, which can admire the vision and question its authenticity at the same time. The boundaries of vision are like mirrors. In each of them, Saudi Arabia sees a different reflection of itself. In the mirror of the desert, pride and courage. In the mirror of tradition, loyalty and resistance. In the mirror of politics, absolute power and the fragility of a single leader. In the mirror of the economy, hope and frustration. In the mirror of psychology, longing and fear. In the mirror of the world, admiration and suspicion. All these reflections add up to the image of a country trying to become more than just an oil monarchy. But is that image reality, or an illusion projected for the world and for its own citizens? We don't know yet. Because each of the boundaries we've discussed remains open, Abdulrahman and Aisha are no less important in this picture than Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Because even though decisions are made in palaces, it is the daily life and courage of ordinary people that will decide whether NEOM becomes a real city or just a mirage in the desert. And this is where our episode ends, not with a full stop, but with a question. Can the boundaries of vision be pushed so far that Saudi Arabia's future truly arrives? Or will it turn out that each of these boundaries is a wall that cannot be jumped over? We will only know the answer when we look deeper, beyond the vision itself, into human stories, political calculations, and global games of interest.